Have you ever felt like money just slips away, no matter how hard you work? Have you ever looked at your bank statement and wondered, why does it seem like nothing changes, no matter how hard I try? Well, David Thomas asked himself those same questions. An ordinary, hard-working man, full of bills, debts, and shelved dreams, he believed the universe wasn't playing in his favor until the day something awakened inside him. But what happens when someone decides to change not just what they do, but what they think? When they begin to see life as a reflection of their own thoughts. This is how David, a man surrounded by scarcity, began to attract opportunities for prosperity that seemed to simply fall from the sky. In this story, you'll discover how the law of attraction transformed David's pessimism into power and lack into abundance. A journey of faith, visualization, and gratitude, the kind that makes you rethink everything you believe about money and destiny. So take advantage and subscribe to the channel, like it, and comment on which city you're watching this story from. Because today, maybe it won't just be David's story that will change. Maybe yours will start to change too. David Thomas was the kind of man who carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. He worked hard, but it seemed like money slipped through his fingers like fine sand. Every month, his salary disappeared into bills and worries, leaving a tightness in his chest that he no longer even tried to hide. His tired expression betrayed sleepless nights, and his eyes, though kind, carried a shadow of discouragement. It was as if life had forgotten to give him a fair chance. He lived in a small suburban apartment where the sounds of the street mingled with the clink of coins he kept in a glass jar. Every penny was counted with the same care. One might guard a secret. David didn't spend impulsively. In fact, he hardly spent at all. He lived in survival mode, even skimping on coffee. But deep down, he dreamed of something bigger, even without knowing if he was entitled to it. Sometimes he'd find himself staring out the window, watching the cars pass by, and imagining what it would be like to drive one of those. Maybe someday, he'd mutter, half-heartedly. Hope was a faint flame, almost extinguished, but still there, stubborn. He wanted to believe things could change, but reality seemed to mock his courage. Deep down, he believed being born poor was fate, not choice. When friends met, they talked about plans, trips, and investment. David listened quietly, with a polite smile, but his mind was immersed in a sea of comparisons. He always felt a step behind, as if the universe had forgotten his address. He was a good, hard-working man, but trapped in an invisible prison called lack. And the more he struggled, the more that word seemed to define his life. But in that silent routine, something inside him began to stir. A subtle, almost imperceptible question began to echo. What if all this wasn't the end of the story? What if there was something he hadn't yet understood about how life really works? David's financial life was like a boat adrift, always patched up, but never truly secure. His salary barely covered basic expenses, and any unforeseen event, no matter how small, turned into a storm. Bills piled up like mountains of paper, and every unknown call made his heart race. Is it the bank again? He lived on a razor's edge, balancing debts and promises that everything will be better next month. On weekends, David tried to forget his worries, but they followed him like a persistent shadow. At night, he lay in bed with his head full of mental calculations, trying to figure out where he was going wrong. It wasn't for lack of effort. He worked hard, sometimes working 2 jobs, but it seemed as if the money had legs and ran away as soon as it arrived. Discouragement was a constant visitor, sitting next to the hope that stubbornly refused to die. Each small victory, a bill paid, a debt renegotiated, was celebrated with the same enthusiasm as someone finding an oasis in the desert. But soon after, reality would knock on the door again. The cycle repeated itself relentlessly. David believed that this was just life as it is, and that people like him had to be content with little. It was an old belief, passed down from generation to generation, and he carried it without realizing its weight. Sometimes he looked at his own dreams as if observing something distant, almost unattainable, a comfortable home, financial freedom, time to live. All these seemed like luxuries reserved for others. He told himself he needed to be realistic, but deep down, he felt that this realism was just a fancy way of giving up. And the more he accepted this idea, the more it became true. But life has a curious way of acting when the soul begins to tire. It was on one of those days of silence and overdue bills that a small spark ignited something new within him. A restlessness, a subtle calling that didn't yet make sense, but promised to change everything. David grew up hearing phrases that became truths in his mind. Money doesn't buy happiness. Those born poor die poor. Life is really hard. These words echoed from childhood, coming from well-meaning family members trapped in the same cycle of scarcity. He repeated them without realizing it, like someone carrying an invisible inheritance. And so, each negative thought took deep root, silently shaping his worldview. For David, money always seemed like a distant, almost unattainable force. When he saw someone prospering, he thought, they must be lucky, or they definitely had help. It was as if he believed the universe had a select group of chosen ones, and he wasn't part of it. This belief prevented him from trying something new, from taking risks, from believing he could do it too. After all, why fight if your destiny was already written? With each bill that arrived, David's mind reinforced the same pattern. There will never be enough left. He spoke this with such conviction that the universe itself seemed to agree. The words, heavy and constant, created the reality he so feared. It was a prophecy disguised as a complaint, and the more he complained, the more reasons he found to continue complaining. But inside him, there was a soft voice, almost a whisper, that told him that perhaps there was another way. A way where money wasn't an enemy, but a reflection of what he believed was possible. Yet this voice was drowned out by the noise of doubts, bad news, and memories of past failures. Until one day, tired of repeating the same cycle, David looked at his own reflection in the mirror and asked himself, what if the problem isn't out there, but in here? It was at that moment that something, however small, began to move. David's days always began the same way. The alarm clock would go off. He'd wake up tired and already feel the weight of the day before he even got out of bed. While he drank coffee, his mind raced to bills, invoices, and demands. It was as if each morning brought the same repeated script, a life on autopilot. He'd leave for work with a serious expression, but inside, he carried a mixture of worry and resignation. During work hours, David did what needed to be done, but his thoughts were elsewhere. Sometimes he'd look at the clock and wonder how many hours were left in the day. Deep down, he felt like he lived to pay bills, and that time, that precious commodity, was slipping away without purpose. His colleagues talked about plans, but he just listened, laughing politely, while an inner voice whispered, "This isn't for you." At night, lying in the dark, my body begged for rest, but my mind insisted on working. I thought about mistakes, missed chances, opportunities that might never return. Sleep came in fits and starts, interrupted by seemingly endless thoughts. It was a silent battle, where the enemy lived inside my own head, and with each dawn, the cycle began again. He tried to cheer himself up with small things, a hot coffee, a good conversation, an occasional laugh, but even in those moments, something was missing. There was a constant feeling of emptiness, as if he were only half living. The worst part wasn't the lack of money, but the death of hope, that, yes, weighed more heavily than any debt. But sometimes it's at rock bottom that we see the reflection of change. And it was in this silent whirlwind that something began to awaken in David, an almost timid desire to understand the reason behind everything. And without knowing it, this simple desire would be the beginning of a transformation. It was an ordinary morning, one of those when everything seems the same, that life decided to play a trick on David. The phone rang, and on the other end came the news he feared most. He was going to be fired. The ground seemed to disappear for a moment. He hung up the phone, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared into space, trying to understand what he had done wrong. The silence in the room weighed more heavily than any word. It was the kind of moment when the world seems to stop, and the mind can only repeat, "What now?" In the days that followed, David walked the streets with slow steps and heavy thoughts. He tried to hide his anguish, but inside he felt a mixture of fear and confusion. The first time he felt he had reached his limit. He had no reserves left, neither financial nor emotional. It was as if the universe had turned its back on him, or perhaps was pushing him down a new path, one he couldn't yet see. One sleepless night, he turned on his computer and began watching random videos. Then a title caught his eye: "The Power of Thoughts in Creating Reality." He clicked, half skeptical, half curious. As he listened, something inside him stirred. The words spoke of energy, vibration, attraction, and an idea began to form in his weary mind. What if, somehow, he had attracted everything he lived? At first, this possibility seemed absurd. David laughed to himself, shook his head, and thought, "How did I attract debt and unemployment?" But at the same time, he felt a spark of curiosity. It was a strange sensation, as if the universe were whispering a secret he never wanted to hear. A silent call to look deeper, and it was there, in the middle of the night, with the glow of the screen illuminating his face and his heart beating differently, that something changed. David didn't yet know what lay ahead, but he felt for the first time in a long time that perhaps there was a hidden exit where before he saw only darkness. For the next few days, David couldn't get what he'd heard in that video out of his head. The idea that thoughts could create reality seemed absurd, yet fascinating at the same time. He began searching for more. He attended lectures, read articles, and almost by chance found an old book at a second-hand stand. The Law of Attraction in Action. The cover was worn, the pages yellowed, but something about the title called to him. It was as if the book had chosen him. On silent nights, David read every word as if searching for a map to escape a maze. He discovered that his thoughts, feelings, and words were like seeds sown in the invisible field of life. He understood that for years he had been watering the soil of scarcity with fear, complaints, and doubts. This idea made him shudder. For the first time, he realized that perhaps he was not a victim of fate, but a co-author of his own story. There was a mixture of excitement and distrust in his chest. He wondered, is it really possible to change with the power of the mind alone? But the more he read, the more he began to notice small signs. Things that had previously gone unnoticed now seemed charged with meaning. A smile from a stranger, a phrase on a billboard, an old memory. Everything seemed to form a mosaic of messages. David began experimenting, gently without telling anyone. He began observing his thoughts and trying to replace it. Won't work with it will work. It was strange at first, almost forced, but he found himself feeling a slight relief, as if a weight were being lifted from his shoulders. Gradually, this new way of thinking began to bring a breath of hope, where before there had only been repetition. And then, during one of those nighttime readings, a phrase made him stop. "What you believe, the universe confirms." He closed the book and stared at the ceiling, feeling a shiver run through his body. Something inside him told him that that simple phrase could change everything, if he had the courage to believe it. David began to put into practice what he had been learning, even though he didn't quite understand how it all worked. He would sit on the edge of his bed, take a deep breath, and try to imagine a different life. At first, he felt silly, a grown man, with his eyes closed, pretending everything was fine when nothing was. But there was something comforting about that little ritual. It was as if, for a few minutes, he stepped out of the storm and found shelter within himself. He tried to visualize small achievements, a bill paid with ease, a leisurely dinner, the feeling of peace upon seeing a positive balance in the bank. At first it seemed like a game of make-believe, but each day it gained more color, more texture, more emotion. It was as if the universe, curious, began to pay attention to this new way of thinking, and without even realizing it, David began to vibrate differently. Doubts, of course, arose constantly. He wondered if he was just fooling himself, if all this was just fancy self-help. But there was something different this time, a genuine desire to test it, to see how far this idea could take him. He promised himself not to give up before trying it for real, and that simple promise was the first step out of the old pattern. One day, while walking through the neighborhood, David noticed something curious. The sun seemed warmer, the people friendlier, and even the air seemed lighter. It was the same old street, but he saw it differently. It was as if the world had changed, but deep down he was the one changing inside. And it was in this lightness that an unexpected thought arose. If I can imagine, maybe I can live. He smiled, a little in disbelief, but with his heart a little more open. And it was in this space of openness that the universe began to approach. David's nights began to take on new meaning. Before they were synonymous with worry, now they became the sacred time of the day. He would dim the lights, put on soft music, and close his eyes. He imagined himself living a life of abundance, feeling the joy of having more than enough. He visualized bills being paid with ease, the sound of positive bank notifications, and the feeling of gratitude pulsing through his chest. It was like watching a movie starring a better version of himself. At first his mind resisted. Doubtful thoughts tried to invade. This is a waste of time. You're dreaming too much. But David learned to let these voices pass, like clouds in the sky. The more he practiced, the more he could truly feel the thrill of thriving. And it was in this feeling, not in the thinking, that the transformation began to happen. Once, during one of these visualizations, he saw himself signing an important contract, smiling confidently. The scene felt so real that his body reacted, his heart raced, his hands tingled. When he opened his eyes, he felt a new energy coursing through every cell. It was as if the universe had given him a glimpse of what was to come. With each new practice, David realized that gratitude was the fuel of creation. He learned to be thankful not only for what he had, but also for what had yet to arrive. "Thank you, universe," he whispered, feeling the words vibrate within him. It was simple, yet powerful. And little by little, something curious began to happen. Unexpected situations began to arise, coincidences that seemed more than mere chance, as if somehow the world was responding to what he felt, and not just what he did. Gratitude became David's new routine, almost a secret ritual. Every morning before even picking up his phone, he would place his hand on his heart and say softly, "Thank you for another day." At first it seemed a simple, almost insignificant gesture, but he soon realized that something changed when he did this. The day began lighter, worries seemed fewer, and even problems approached with a strange kind of calm. It was as if life had suddenly taken on a different tone. He began to give thanks for everything, for the bed he slept in, the hot coffee, the fresh morning air. And the more he gave thanks, the more good things seemed to happen. They weren't miracles, they were small details. A neighbor offering to help, a lower bill, a conversation that opened a new idea. David began to realize that gratitude was like a magic key, capable of unlocking invisible doors. During the day, he carried a small notebook in his pocket, where he wrote down everything that sparked his feelings of gratitude. Sometimes a word, sometimes a smile. This became his positive energy amulet. He began to notice how much the universe rewarded his new way of seeing the world. What once seemed like a lack now became abundance in small daily doses. At night, before going to sleep, he would review what he had written and feel his heart warm. It was as if he were reaping the fruits of a garden he had been silently cultivating. And the more he gave thanks, the more the garden flourished, both within and without. And it was in this rhythm of recognition and joy that something even greater began to take shape. A profound change, one he couldn't name, but could feel coming, silent and certain, like the dawn. As the days passed, David began to realize that something in him had changed, and it wasn't just his way of thinking, but his way of feeling. That old sense of fear and helplessness was giving way to a curious peace, a quiet confidence that things were falling into place. He still didn't have any money to spare, but he no longer lived in emotional scarcity. It was as if he had exchanged the weight of worries for the lightness of faith. The old thoughts tried to creep back in, of course. Sometimes he caught himself thinking, "This isn't going to work." But now there was a difference. He recognized these thoughts and let them go. He learned he didn't need to fight them. He could simply replace them with kinder ones. He began to mentally repeat empowering phrases, and each one felt like a new brick in the construction of a thriving mind. People around him began to notice. "You look different," they said, and he smiled, unable to explain it. It was a change happening from the inside out, subtle but powerful. Anger gave way to patience, anxiety to hope. Even the little things, a compliment, a sunset, a good song, seemed more alive. Little by little, David understood that prosperity wasn't just about having money, but about feeling worthy of it. That wealth began in the mind, not in the wallet. This realization brought a relief he'd never felt before, as if the universe finally breathed along with him. And in this new attunement, he began to notice curious signs, coincidences, encounters, ideas, as if life were inviting him to take the next step, a step that would change everything. David began to realize the power of the words he said to himself. Before, he'd repeated phrases that kept him stuck. "I never have any luck. Money is hard to come by. This isn't for me." Now he replaced them with affirmations that vibrated differently. Standing in the mirror, he'd look into his own eyes and say, "I am a magnet for prosperity. Money flows easily to me." At first it felt strange, almost like acting. But over time, those words began to take on truth. He understood that the brain was like a garden, and thoughts were like seeds. For years he had cultivated weeds of doubt and fear, but now he had decided to plant faith and abundance. Every day before leaving home, he would pause and repeat his new affirmation. And the curious thing is that even before seeing the results, he already felt better, more confident, more whole, more in control of his own destiny. People who knew him were astonished. "You've been saying some different things," they'd say with a half smile. David would simply reply, "I'm learning to think differently." And this simple shift, invisible to the naked eye, began to have real effects. Situations that had previously irritated him now seemed like learning opportunities. He reacted differently, and the world reacted to him the same way. At night he wrote his affirmations in a notebook, as if conversing with the universe. "I am prosperous. I attract opportunities. My mind is fertile with ideas." With each sentence, he felt his energy renew. It was as if he were rewriting his own internal code, a silent command instructing life to respond differently. And the more he repeated it, the more natural it all became, until one day he realized he was no longer just saying it, he was believing it. And this new faith seemed to announce that something big was about to happen. That's when David began to notice things that had previously gone unnoticed. One day, he found a 50 real note forgotten in the pocket of an old pair of pants. The next, a colleague mentioned a free finance course and invited him to participate. Simple, almost banal things, but they seemed charged with meaning. He began to feel that the universe was somehow responding to his new way of thinking, and it made him smile without knowing why. Coincidences began to repeat themselves. An acquaintance recommended him for a small extra job, which paid more than he expected. A lost email in his inbox brought an opportunity that seemed tailor-made. And amidst these events, a feeling grew within him that nothing was by chance. It was as if the world was whispering, "Keep it up," whenever he chose to trust. At each sign, David felt a slight shiver, that kind of certainty that can't be explained. He began to walk more attentively, noticing the same time on the clock, the words that repeated themselves in conversations, the situations that fit together perfectly. He perceived an invisible thread connecting every detail of life. And for the first time he felt he wasn't alone on this journey. These signs, though small, had the power to transform his days. Hope ceased to be a theory and became a reality. The fear of failure gave way to curiosity about what would come next. It was like watching life unfold in sync with his thoughts, and it enchanted him. And it was then that amidst this newfound confidence, an unexpected opportunity arose, testing everything he had learned up until that point. Just when life seemed to finally be in harmony, the universe decided to test David's. One morning he received an unexpected proposal. A friend invited him to invest in a promising small business. It was a real chance to change his financial situation, but it also involved risk. The old David, driven by fear, would have refused without a second thought. But the new David was torn between his old doubt and the new confidence he had been cultivating. In the days that followed, his mind became a battleground. One side said, "What if this goes wrong? You'll lose everything." The other whispered, "What if this is the start of something big?" He paced the house restlessly, looking at the ceiling, the floor, as if waiting for an answer to fall from the sky. The uncertainty hurt, but there was also something new there. A sense that this challenge was no accident. One of those sleepless nights he picked up his gratitude notebook and began writing. Instead of complaining about his doubt, he was grateful for the opportunity. He was grateful for having gotten this far, for learning to trust. As he wrote, he felt a strange calm, the same calm that comes when the heart already knows the answer, even before the mind accepts it. The next day he woke up determined. He looked in the mirror and said, "I trust. If this door has appeared, it's because I'm ready to walk through it." It was a simple yet powerful moment, a leap of faith without a net, sustained only by the certainty that the universe never misses a beat. And so he took the first step, not knowing that from that investment would come something that would completely change the course of his life. The next morning, David woke up feeling lighter, but his heart was still pounding. The invitation to invest still lingered in his thoughts, like a half-open door calling his name. He knew that decision could change everything, for better or for worse. Making such a choice required more than courage. It required faith. And for the first time, he decided to listen to his heart, instead of the old voices of fear. He walked through the city, observing the people, the signs, the movement. Everything seemed to give him subtle signs of encouragement. "Trust the process," read a store sign. "Keep moving," said a song that played randomly. It was as if the entire universe were conspiring to confirm what he already felt. The moment was now, and between uncertainty and intuition, he finally chose to believe. When he sat down before his friend to sign the agreement, his hands were shaking, but his gaze was steady. This wasn't just a financial investment, it was an investment in himself, in his new way of seeing the world. He understood that true prosperity begins when we stop acting out of fear and start acting with purpose. Once everything was settled, he walked to a nearby park, took a deep breath, and smiled. He felt free, as if he had freed himself from something much bigger than money. The light breeze touched his face, and he had the distinct feeling that something good was on its way, like the calm that comes before a sunrise. And as he watched the sky change color, he could hardly imagine that his seemingly simple choice would be the beginning of a turnaround he would never forget. After making the decision, David felt a different energy coursing through his body, a mixture of nervousness and excitement. It was as if the universe was watching, waiting for his first move to align the pieces on the board. He began to act, but in a new way, with ease, confidence, and presence. Each step seemed guided by something greater, as if an invisible force were saying, "Keep going, I'm with you." He dove into the project with passion. He researched, studied, and connected with the right people. Everything flowed with surprising ease. Ideas came like waves, and each one seemed to open a new opportunity. It was as if life itself responded to his courage, rewarding the action born of faith. For the first time, David wasn't acting out of desperation, but out of inspiration. Sure, there were obstacles, moments when things didn't go as planned. But instead of complaining, he took a deep breath and said, "This is part of it too." And somehow, solutions appear, an unexpected contact, a phone call, a sudden insight. It seemed like magic, but he knew it was attunement. He was finally aligned with the flow of abundance. As the days passed, the project began to grow. People became interested, results appeared, and the financial return, previously only a hope, began to become a reality. David felt that life rewarded him not only for what he did, but for the energy with which he did it. And as he watched the first victories unfold, he realized this was not the end of the journey, but the beginning of a new phase. The phase in which the universe would truly begin to surprise him. Weeks turned into months, and David's project began to take on a life of its own. What was supposed to be a modest investment became an unexpected success. The business grew rapidly, attracting partners and clients who seemed hand-picked by fate. It was remarkable how everything fell into place. Opportunities coming from unlikely places, the right people appearing at just the right time, and results that surpassed any expectation. One day, sitting on his porch with a cup of coffee in his hands, David looked at his bank statement and smiled silently. The balance now showed numbers he'd never imagined seeing. But what moved him most wasn't the money itself. It was the feeling of having proven to himself that it was possible to change the course of his own life. Prosperity, he realized, began in the mind long before it reached the pocket. People around him began to notice the transformation. Friends who had previously doubted him now sought him out for advice. "How did you turn things around?" they asked. David would just smile and say, "I learned to think differently." There was no secret, just a new way of connecting with life, with gratitude, faith, and inspired action. He realized that the universe had responded to his new vibration with generosity. It was as if all of this had been waiting for his permission all along. And now, with a heart full of gratitude, he understood that none of it had been coincidence. It was consequence. But the best part was yet to come. David's true reward wouldn't be measured in numbers, but in what he would discover about himself, the power of the mind, and the purpose of sharing that with the world. It was only after everything happened that David truly understood what he had experienced. He looked back and saw how much the transformation began within him, long before it appeared on the outside. He understood that the change didn't come from money or investment. It came from the mind. From the moment he decided to exchange fear for faith, doubt for certainty, scarcity for gratitude. What he once called luck now had another name: alignment. One afternoon, while walking through a park, David stopped before a tranquil lake and saw his own reflection in the water. "I created this," he thought. And he didn't say it arrogantly, but with humility and amazement. For the first time, he felt the true power of consciousness, the power to choose what to feel, what to think, and what to attract. That realization made him smile, and at the same time, deeply moved. He remembered the sleepless nights, the bills piling up, the days when he believed the universe had forgotten him. And now he understood none of it had been punishment, but a learning experience. Each challenge was an invitation to awaken. Each fall, an opportunity to rise stronger. What once seemed like chaos now revealed itself as a perfectly designed path. David began to feel a new responsibility, that of tending his own thoughts, like one tending a sacred garden. He began to choose what he allowed to flourish within himself, knowing that the outside world merely reflected this. Life, he realized, was not a battle against fate, but a dance with the invisible. And in that moment of silence and gratitude, he knew the greatest investment anyone can make is in themselves. And this certainty ignited in him the desire to share with others what he had discovered. As time passed, David's life completely transformed. His former anxiety gave way to a serene tranquility, as if he had finally learned to trust the rhythm of life. Money now flowed naturally, not as something to be pursued, but as a consequence of the inner balance he cultivated every day. It was a new, almost magical sensation, prospering without wearing himself out, receiving without fear of loss, living without the rush to arrive. The days of scarcity seemed like a distant dream. David would wake up early, sip his coffee slowly, feel the sun touch his face, and be grateful for being alive. There was no more rush, only purpose. He worked with pleasure, leading with empathy and clarity, and the more he followed his intuition, the more doors opened, invitations, partnerships, opportunities. It was as if the universe, now in perfect harmony with him, conspired daily in his favor. But the greatest transformation wasn't in the numbers, but in his awareness. David no longer saw money as an end, but rather as a means to create, help, and inspire. He began donating part of his earnings, supporting causes that touched his heart. And each act of generosity seemed to multiply what he had, proving that true abundance is that which overflows. People saw him as an example, but he knew he was just someone who learned to believe. He understood that there is no secret to prosperity. There is vibration, attunement, and intention. He no longer waited for life to change. He had become the change himself. And this realization was the greatest gift of all. And as time passed, a new mission formed within him, to carry this message forward, so that other people could also discover the power that had always been within them. David's transformation wasn't limited to his own life. It began to touch those around him. Friends, family, and even distant colleagues approached him, curious about this almost palpable change. He no longer spoke of debt or hardship, but of possibilities, dreams, and energy. People sensed something different about him, a contagious calm, a light that seemed to ignite hope in those who listened to his stories. It was as if, as he prospered, he had become a mirror where others saw what they too could be. Soon, invitations began pouring in for him to share his journey. Small gatherings in cafes, conversation circles, impromptu lectures at schools. David spoke simply, without mystery, with an open heart. He spoke about gratitude, about his thoughts, about the power of faith in action. And each word seemed to resonate with people, awakening something that was also dormant within them. He didn't see himself as a master, much less a guru. He saw himself as an ordinary person who learned to observe life's signs and trust his own energy. And that was precisely what made him inspiring. His authenticity. By telling his story, he helped each person see themselves at some point along the way. And this identification planted seeds of transformation wherever he went. Over time, David realized he was building something bigger than he imagined. A movement of people learning to thrive from the inside out, to believe in their own strength, to free themselves from fear. It was beautiful to see that cycle expanding like ripples in a pond after a stone is thrown. Prosperity, he understood, is contagious, and it was in this collective awakening that David began to feel that he had fulfilled an important part of his mission. But the universe, as always, still had one last surprise in store for him. One night, David sat silently on the porch, gazing at the star-studded sky. The wind carried the soft scent of night, and in the distance, the quiet sounds of the city. He took a deep breath and felt a profound peace, one of those that can't be explained, only felt. He thought about everything he'd experienced, the fear, the debts, the sleepless nights, the tears, the new beginnings. It all made sense now. He realized that life was never punishing him. It was only preparing him to understand the power that had always existed within him. As he gazed at the stars, a thought dawned on him. Abundance isn't out there, it's here. He touched his chest and smiled. It was simple, but true. Everything he'd ever sought, security, purpose, prosperity, flourished the moment he learned to trust. Not in the world, not in others, but in the invisible force that inhabits every thought of faith and every gesture of gratitude. Now, he no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. Life had become a gentle dance, guided by intuition and love. The money kept coming, the projects grew, but none of that was the center. The center was the state of peace he cultivated daily. He understood that thriving isn't about conquering, but about allowing the universe to flow through you without resist. David closed his eyes and gave thanks. He gave thanks for the past, the present, and what was yet to come. He felt whole, free, and connected. It was as if every star in the sky blinked back in recognition, celebrating the awakening of someone who finally understood the dance of life. And in that silent moment, he knew, when the mind believes, the heart feels, and the soul trusts, the entire universe conspires in favor. And so, David Thomas discovered something most people spend their entire lives failing to realize. The secret to prosperity lies not in hard work, nor in luck, but in believing is possible. When he shifted his focus from fear to gratitude, the universe began to respond in ways he could never have imagined. David's mind ceased to be a prison and became the starting point for a new destiny. He understood that wealth is merely a reflection of an abundant consciousness, and that when you feel worthy, the universe finds a way to prove you right. Perhaps the most beautiful lesson from David's journey is this: everything begins within you. A new thought, a feeling of faith, a simple thank you can open paths that were dormant. Life doesn't change when you fight it. It changes when you start dancing to the same rhythm. So, if this story inspired you, if it lit a spark of hope in you, remember, nothing happens by chance, not even the fact that you've made it this far. Subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and leave in the comments what touched you most about David's journey, because, who knows, the next prosperity story I tell could be yours.